not related to armaments going to decline. The decline in effectiveness in economic lobbying groups in the Third Reich, that through every major German industrialist called for that though every major German industrialist called for a reduction of working class living standards from 1933 onwards, before 1942 the German Nazi Party always ignored such calls and sought instead to raise working class living standards. Mason's primacy of politics approach against the traditional Marxist primacy of economics approach involved him in the 1960s with a vigorous debate with the East German historian Eberhard Kriegshahn and Dietrich Eicherholz and Kurt Gossweller. The later two historians wrote, if Mason was correct, then this would amount to a complete refutation of Marxist social analysis. The year 1936 also represents a turning point for German trade union policy. German trade policy. Hagemal Schacht was replaced in 1936 in September by Hitler's lieutenant Hermann Göring with a mandate to make Germany self-sufficient to fight a war within 4 years. Under Göring, imports were slashed, wages and prices were controlled, under penalty of being sent to a concentration camp. Dividends were restricted to 6% on book capital, and strategic goals to be reached at all costs were declared. The construction of synthetic rubber plants, more steel plants, automatic textile factories. World prices for raw materials, which constituted the bulk of German imports, were on the rise. At the same time, world prices for manufactured goods, Germany's chief exports, were falling. The result was that Germany found itself increasingly difficult to maintain a balance of payments. A large deficit seemed almost inevitable, but Hitler found the prospects unacceptable. Thus, Germany, following Italy's lead, began to move away from partially free trade into the direction of economic self-sufficiency. Unlike Italy, however, Germany did not strive to achieve full self-sufficiency. Hitler was aware of the fact that Germany lacked reserves of raw materials and full self-sufficiency was therefore impossible. Thus he chose a different approach. The Nazi government tried to limit the number of trade partners and when possible only trade with countries within the German sphere of influence. A number of bilateral trade agreements were signed between Germany and other European countries, mostly located in southern and southeastern Europe during the 1930s. This would be Romania with its oil supply. The German government strongly encouraged trade with these countries, but strongly discouraged trade with others. By the 1930s, the aims of German trade policy were to use economic and political powers to make countries in southern Europe and the Balkans dependent on Germany. The German economy would draw its raw materials from that region, and the countries in question would receive German manufactured goods in exchange. Already in 1938, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Greece transacted 50% of their foreign trade with Germany. Throughout the 1930s, German businesses were encouraged to form cartels, monopolies and oligopolies, whose interests were then protected by the state. In his book, Big Business in the Third Reich, Arthur Schweitzer notes that monopolistic price fiction became the rule in most industries. Cartels were no longer confined to the heavy or large-scale industries. Cartels and quasi-cartels, whether of big business or small, set prices, engaged in limiting production, and agreed to divide markets and classify consumers in order to realise a monopoly profit. As big business became increasingly organised, it developed in an increasingly close partnership with the Nazi government. The government pursued economic policies that maximised the profits of business allies and in exchange business leaders supported the government's political and military goals. So you can see there you've got regulatory capture, in the traditional sense of the word, but you've also got corruption. The business has been corporatised to the extent that it's fused with the state, so the state becomes a monopoly. Well, the strict state intervention into the economy and massive rearmament policy led to full employment during the 1930s. Real wages in Germany dropped by roughly 25% between 1933 and 1938. Trade unions were abolished, as well as collective bargaining and the right to strike. The right to quit was also disappeared. Labour books were introduced in 1935 and required the consent of the previous employer in order to be hired for another job. In place of ordinary profit incentive to guide investment, investment was guided through regulation to accord with the needs of the state. Government financing eventually came to dominate the investment process, which the proportion of private securities issued falling from over half of the total in 1933 to 1934 to approximately 10% in 1935 to 1938. Heavy taxes on profits limited self-financing firms. The largest firms were mostly exempt from taxes on profits, but government controls of these were extensive enough to leave only the shell of private ownership. A major historical debate about the relationship between the German economy and foreign policy decision making was prompted in the late 1980s when British Marxist historian Timothy Mason claimed that an economic crisis had caused a flight into war in 1939. Mason's arguments were that German working class was always opposed to the Nazi dictatorship, and that in the overheated German economy of the late 1930s, German workers could force employers to grant higher wages by leaving for another firm that would grant the desired wage increases. But this was a form of political resistance, and a resistance forced Adolf Hitler to go into war in 1939. From my point of view, that is a really thin argument. That is not based on fact. Thus, the outbreak of the Second World War was caused by structural economic problems, a flight into war imposed by a domestic crisis. The key aspects of the crisis were, according to Mason, a shaky economic recovery was threatened by a rearmament program that overwhelmed the economy, and in which the Nazi regime's nationalist bluster limited its options. In this way, Mason articulated a Primat der Interpolitik, primacy of domestic politics view of World War II, its origins, through the concept of social imperialism. Mason's Primat der Interpolitik thesis was marked in contrast to the Primer Überpolitik, primacy of foreign politics, usually used to explain World War II. In Mason's opinion, German foreign policy was driven by domestic political considerations, and the launch of World War II in 1939 was best understood as a barbaric variant of social imperialism. Mason argued that Nazi Germany was always bent at some time upon a major war of expansion. However, Mason argued that the timing of such a war was determined by domestic political pressures, especially as relating to a failing economy, and had nothing to do with what Hitler wanted. In Mason's view, in the period 1936 to 1941, it was the state of German economy and not Hitler's will or intentions that was the most important determinant of German decision-making on foreign policy. Mason argued that Nazi leaders were deeply haunted by the November Revolution of 1918 and were unwilling to see any fall in the working class living standards out of fear that it might provoke another November Revolution. On that I would agree with him. According to Mason, by 1939, the overheating of the German economy caused by rearmament